Welcome to the Economic and Political History Podcast, where we discuss the latest ideas on the intersection of economics, political science, and history. Welcome to a new episode of the Economic and Political History Podcast. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure of being with Agustina Paglayan. Agustina is assistant professor at UC San Diego's School of Global Policy and Department of Political Science. And she's the author of a new book called Race to Obey, The Rise and Spread of Mass Education. It is a book published by Princeton University Press. Agustina, how are you?
Hi, Javier. I'm doing great. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
No, thanks for accepting the invitation. I would like to start the conversation by asking you about your career. I know you're Argentinian. You did your PhD in this same building. How was that path coming from Argentina? I also know that you did a bachelor's in econ, didn't you?
Yes. So I studied economics as an undergraduate at Universidad de San Andrés in Argentina. And then from there, I actually spent several years working first as a macroeconomist with the current president, Javier Mejia. And then from there, and from there, then I moved to Washington, D.C. and worked on international development issues, advising governments in many different countries around the world on a number of different types of reforms, including education reform. And then after that, I moved to Stanford, where I pursued my PhD in political science.
Can I ask you, I'm sorry, I don't want to deviate the conversation from what our main objective, but now that you said you worked with Milei, how was that experience?
It was a short experience. He stayed, we worked at what at the time was one of the most prestigious macroeconomics consulting firms in Argentina. It was a really small team, so we worked really close together. We wrote reports for the IMF and for the Economist Intelligence Unit, producing forecasts on GDP per capita, etc. He was there for around 6 months. I was there for around 3 years, so we didn't overlap for too long, but there were some aspects of his personality that were already there, just like very explosive type of personality. And it was interesting in retrospect to think that a former colleague of mine became president of Argentina. But we can come back to talking about Milei and his views about indoctrination, which he has some in the context of this conversation. But let's talk about the book.
Yeah, of course. Your book is about education, and you focus on the spread of what you describe as mass education, that is such a crucial part of our modern world, that everyone goes to at least primary school, that it's not obvious what's the origin of that. Why don't you tell us about that, right? So before getting to the causes behind that expansion, when did it begin? How rapid was this? How should we think about the empirical facts of education becoming this regular thing in our lives?
Right, because today we all take it for granted. We become 6 years old or 5 years old, depending on the country or state. And then you start going to school and you spend 12 years in school. Maybe afterwards you go to college. And the school that you go to is regulated heavily by the government, right? The government says, among other things, that you have to go to school. But it also dictates the curriculum. It shapes what are the requirements that teachers need to meet in order to become teachers. And so there's a lot of intervention on the part of the government in children's education. This wasn't always so. So if you were to go back 250 years, in the 18th century, this did not exist. So the move began primarily in Prussia. At the end of the 18th century, it was the first country where the government created a compulsory primary education system with a very regimented primary education experience, dictating everything from the curriculum to the daily schedule to how teachers had to be trained, et cetera, et cetera. And from there, other countries followed suit. So first, some other countries in Western Europe, then the United States, later Canada, afterwards Latin America, and then other developing regions didn't follow until much later, primarily after World War II. So if you take kind of since Prussia began its efforts until the present, or roughly around 2010, almost all countries had accomplished universal primary education. So you have a 200-year time span, but within each country it didn't last 200 years. So, for example, in France, the first big push toward expanding primary education began in the 1830s, and by 1860 they had already accomplished universal primary education for boys. And in Argentina, the big push began in the 1880s, and before the mid-20th century, they had already accomplished universal primary education. So the pace differed between countries in the former Soviet Union. It was much faster. Within 2 decades, they moved from tiny access to primary schooling to, in the context of the Stalinist regime, extremely rapid expansion of access to primary education. So the pace differed, and when did governments take over control and regulation of primary education also differed across countries. But the whole process, again, from when did Prussia, who was the leader, the first mover, and when did Prussia begin, up to when did most countries accomplish universal primary education, that took roughly 200 years.
And I guess the inevitable question then is like, why this happened, right? It's such a large-scale effort, and you have your thesis. The book is about convincing us that that's the main explanation. But before talking about that thesis, why don't you share with us what other explanations have been out there, and why do you think that those explanations are just not the right ones?
Sure. So there are, I would say, 3 main explanations for what drove the push for mass primary education that I argue are not particularly compelling. And one thing before we keep talking is the focus of the book is in explaining why the Western world led the expansion, because of what I just said, right? It began in Prussia and Western Europe, the US, Canada, Latin America. And the rest of the world, African countries, Asian countries, came much later in their efforts to expand primary education. And so the goal of the book is to explain why the Western world led. And so the explanations for what drives primary education expansion differ a little bit. If you look at the West versus the non-West, and given the focus of the book on the explaining why the West led, there are 3 common explanations that have been put out there that I argue actually do not go far in explaining why Western societies led the expansion of primary education. The first one is democratization. So the idea that the spread of democracy was the big driver of the expansion of access to education for everyone. Another very common explanation is industrialization, that it was the needs of an industrial economy that created demand for a skilled, large workforce, that then governments met that demand by expanding access to education. And then the third common explanation has to do with interstate wars and a sense that if there were threats from foreign countries that were trying to conquer you, then you were better off trying to educate the population, both to instill patriotism and to train future soldiers so that you could fight these wars more effectively. And so in the book, I argue that none of those arguments really go very far in explaining why the West led the expansion. And just to give you a little bit of the evidence behind why I say that these explanations don't go far, in the case of democracy, the timing just doesn't add up. So the expansion of primary education in the West took place much earlier than the spread of democracy. By the time democracy arrived for the first time in European countries, for example, 70% of children already had access to primary education. So the bulk of the expansion happens well before democratization. And so if democratization can't explain why that bulk of the expansion happened, because it just came too late to be an explanation. The same thing happens with Latin American countries. When we look at industrialization, as I told you, we have several cases that exemplify why industrialization is a poor explanation. So Prussia, on one hand, was the leader in expanding primary education while it was still an agrarian economy. So pre-industrial Prussia made a big push to regulate and expand primary education. On the other hand, the industrial leader in Western Europe was England. England was, in fact, the laggard in expanding access to primary education. So there you have a clear set of two examples that just illustrate how the industrialization argument doesn't really go far. But also in the book, I look at more countries, and there really is, there isn't a consistent pattern. There are some countries where the onset of industrialization does coincide with the period when governments start taking control of education and start expanding it. But for the most part, those countries are a minority. In most countries, it either just doesn't coincide at all, or it's like in Prussia, it happens in pre-industrial periods. So that's for the industrialization argument. And then we can also talk about how industrialists also themselves often initially opposed mass education because they thought that if you put all kids in school, labor supply was going to become smaller and they were going to have to pay higher wages to those who were left in the workforce. And so they, at first they opposed it. They weren't the initiators. It took some convincing until they came around. And then finally, the interstate war argument, again, it's just the argument itself, it sounds plausible. There's nothing logically wrong with it, but the empirical evidence is not there for that argument. What you see is not that after interstate wars, you have large expansions of primary education in Western countries. You do see an expansion, but the expansion that happens after interstate wars is just recovery of the enrollment drops that happen during a war. So it's not new enrollment that's happening that wouldn't have happened in the absence of wars.
Okay, so I mean,
so those are the arguments. Those are the ones that I don't think take us far.
It's fascinating because I mean, with that you said the stage for something that looks fairly paradoxical, right? So you have overall expansion of education in places that are still mainly agrarian, that are largely authoritarian.
Exactly.
In periods where they were not exactly facing external threats, right? So what's then your explanation about why do states have incentives to procure these large investments to put all these kids in school? And well, I'm not going to steal away the mystery of it. Tell us what is the explanation that you think is the right one.
So what I find evidence for is that it's really about internal threats, and particularly the popular classes, the masses, engaging in rebellion, civil war, insurrections, peasant revolts, food riots, but some form of violence against the state. And these episodes of internal conflict generate a lot of anxiety among political rulers about the problem of maintaining social order, which is probably the primary goal of any state. They generate anxiety. They give them the sense that their existing policy tools, like using repression, are not sufficiently efficacious in containing social disorder. And it is in these moments of internal conflict that political elites come together around the idea of using mass education to prevent future generations from rebelling against the state by using indoctrination to teach them obedience. So using schools not to improve skills or to promote social mobility, but rather using schools to teach people to stay put, to respect the state, to respect authority, to respect the laws that the state passes, and therefore to accept the status quo and not rebel against the established order.
I want to follow up on this idea of respecting the status quo and stay for a bit talking about the sort of political philosophy of the argument, right? And your book is actually quite rich in that, right? Exploring what people were saying and were thinking during this period. And then I guess my first question is on that, right? So when you see the intellectual discussions on this matter, the people favoring this type of policies were thinking about authority and obedience and like in which dimensions. And the way in which I was thinking about this while I was reading the book, it was probably very silly, but when you teach a dog to obey, like it's in a very specific realm, right? You want the dog to obey you and maybe to attack other humans, or right? So I guess what I'm thinking here is that the concern was about obeying the state, obeying the ruler, the family, the institution. I mean, like, what type of arguments were the ones describing obedience, and to what type of entities in society were directed to?
So it certainly wasn't about obeying the family. So this is precisely the opposite, right? These are periods of state building and state formation, where states are trying to become legitimate in the eyes of the population and get them to comply with the many rules that states have around. You have to pay your taxes, or you have to enroll in the army, or even more mundane things like you shouldn't vandalize buildings, or you shouldn't destroy other people's property, and so on and so forth. So it's a period where the state is trying to have people accept the rules that the state is putting in place to regulate society, to regulate interactions between people. And the ultimate goal then is to forge obedience to the state and its laws, but it's not done in that overt way. So the way that they think about it is, what we're going to do is we're going to put teachers in the classroom to work with children and to teach children to respect the rules of the school, right? They're not trying to teach them to pay taxes necessarily, although some textbooks do include kind of some content on that, and other kind of general rules as well. But the basic thing is just to get kids to used to following rules. So, for example, if you want to go to the bathroom, you need to raise your hand and get permission. If you want to speak in class, you need to raise your hand and get the teacher's permission. If you want to go have some recreation time, you need to wait until the teacher authorizes you to do so. And when the time comes, you're going to form a line and walk all quietly to the recreation area. And there are some things that are not allowed in recreation area. You can't throw balls, the rules are going to vary across schools. But the idea is to get kids used to following all kinds of rules. You can't dress this way. You can't wear that type of hair and so on and so forth. So it's a softer type of getting kids used to the fact that there are rules that they don't choose. They're put in place by an authority. In the school, it's the teacher and it's the school principal who set that authority. But the idea of education reformers is, if kids learn to respect rules at that young age, then when they continue and become adults and go through their lives, they will respect the state's rules and the state's laws.
I'm just thinking about how, it's a fascinating claim, it resonates so vividly at a personal level. I don't know if everyone, I had an experience at school where I remember thinking regularly, this is geo, like why do we have to follow these rules? So
Exactly.
It's fascinating, like the description that you have just done of that just brought me back my days.
Yeah, and I think everyone has an experience that they can go back to, that they think, why this arbitrary, ridiculous rule, right? And the point wasn't for the rules necessarily to make sense. It was just, you have to follow them because there's an authority that knows better than you, that says that is the rule you need to follow. And so there were all kinds of, then the question is, okay, how do you get kids to follow the rules, right? And so they used a lot of rewards and punishments. But again, so here, like, people sometimes might think, oh, physical punishment. actually, no, there was a lot of conversation. There was obviously physical punishment, but there was a lot of conversation among political philosophers in the Enlightenment who said, actually, physical punishment should be a last resort mechanism. We should try to prevent that from getting to that stage, because what we're trying to teach kids ultimately is for them not to engage in violence. That's the whole point, right? We want to promote social order. We don't want people to be violent. And so if we use physical punishment and we're teaching them through example, they're going to get a sense that violence is sometimes okay. And we don't want to get them to think that that's true. So what they thought of was like, let's use more soft types of punishment. So humiliation. Let's get kids to be like scolded in front of their peers or put in the corner, or these kinds of like social punishment, and other forms of punishment, like being sent to the principal's office, being suspended, and so on and so forth. That made kids feel humiliated and then made them feel there was a cost to violating the rules, this social cost in some ways. And likewise, they used rewards, right? Like we still have in schools, like the kids who behave really well, maybe they'll get a sticker for excellent behavior. So they did the same things, like they would start like praising the kids who followed, who were like the teacher's pet, and so on and so forth. Again, to try to highlight the benefits of complying and the costs of not complying with rules.
Tell me more about that intellectual conversation, right? Because it seems like such an entirely new institutional design, and I'm curious then about, we're talking about this, was this a mostly common conversation in conservative circles? Was this across the ideological spectrum? Who was talking about this as a good idea among intellectuals?
So this is an interesting question that you pose, because I think that usually people, as they hear me talk, they might suspect this was something that conservatives pushed, right? Like the based on current standards, that's what you would expect, that it's conservatives that push for discipline, that push for a law and order type of agenda. But back in the day, in the 18th and 19th century, liberals and conservatives both pushed for this use of education as a form of social control and teaching obedience. And maybe one of the Enlightenment philosophers that people will be most familiar, who shaped liberal political thought very heavily, is Rousseau. And he was one of the Enlightenment philosophers who articulated that in the same way that there are laws for adults, he says, there should be laws for children. And those laws for children should highlight the importance of obedience. And he also says it is above all in the state's own interest to teach obedience to children for the sake of the state's own viability and durability. So this was pervasive across the ideological spectrum. If you fast forward a little bit with the rise of then radical liberal parties, those parties start pushing against this type of narrative, but they were kind of much smaller in their size, and they came after the foundation of primary education systems. So the interesting thing about these episodes I was telling you before, right, about internal conflict, is that these ideas we're talking about floated around, and they were the mainstream way of thinking about education in the early 19th century. The issue was, for a lot of governments, they were like, well, I'm not gonna, this sounds good, but it also comes with a lot of costs, because I have to construct a lot of schools, I have to train a lot of teachers, it takes a lot of money. Plus, we don't all agree necessarily on what exactly the moral education that we're going to provide to kids will look like. Should it be religious? Should it be non-religious? What's interesting then about these episodes of internal conflict is that they bring conservatives and liberals together. Instead of keep fighting about how would this look like and what type of moral education are we going to provide, suddenly all the elites become really concerned about their prospects and their ability to stay in power if they don't find a way to better contain the masses and prevent them from engaging in violence. And so they leave aside, they still fight over the curriculum, etc., but they leave aside to some extent their disagreement, and they all come on board towards saying, okay, now we have a shared agreement that this has become urgent, that we need to push for mass education to prevent something like the internal conflict we just experienced from happening again.
Why don't you tell us a bit about the Prussian keys, maybe to illustrate exactly what you're describing? What were the events that were triggering eventually the state to say, like, okay, let's really do this now that intellectuals seem to be supporting this and it's costly, but it's worth like doing.
So Prussia has first 1763 is the year when they introduced the General Rural Schools Regulations, which introduced compulsory schooling in rural Protestant areas. And the antecedent to that regulation is a series of peasant revolts that happened in the 1740s and 1750s. So Prussia had historically a seigneurial system where you had landlords who owned land and peasants who lived and worked in that land. And they had a long-lasting relationship, these peasants and their landlords. They had lived together for a really long time, right? And so they had this sense, the peasants in some ways had a sense of duty toward these landlords who, in exchange for working in the land, they protected them from foreign, like outside attacks. So what happens in the 1740s and 1750s, first, there's a lot of rotation of who owns land. And a lot of new people start owning land and expecting peasants to work in the land for them, but they don't have these long existing social ties that make the peasants feel a sense of duty, because who is this new guy? I don't know him, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing that also happens is there are a series of droughts that happen throughout Europe and affecting Prussia in particular that lead to an increase in grain prices. And as a result of that, a lot of these landlords, many of them new landlords, want peasants to work even more in the land. And so they're asking them to work, like obliging them to work for 6 days a week, for example. And so the peasants are like, wait, dude, I don't know you. I don't feel any sense of duty to or loyalty toward you. And now you're wanting to exploit me even more so. And so peasants start revolting against these landlords. And the king becomes really concerned about the problem of disorder in the countryside, because up until then, he had relied on these landlords to maintain the social equilibrium. And suddenly there's a sense that this seigneurial authority is breaking down, and that's leading to a crisis of social order in the countryside. And so the king needs to think, okay, how are we going to maintain social order in the countryside moving forward? So his advisors tell him we should do two things. The first thing is we should do agrarian reform, pass a royal decree that essentially gives the peasants what they're asking for, which is a reduction in the number of days that they are required to work for the landlords. So bypass the landlords who are asking peasants to work for 6 days, and just by royal decree, reduce that amount. And so that, in the short term, will get peasants to kind of calm down a little bit. But what the king's advisors also tell him is this can't be your only strategy, because nothing prevents that you're going to appease these peasants today, but nothing prevents them in the future from asking for more things from you. So what you need to do is you need to also put them all in schools where you control the curriculum, you control who the teachers are, and teach them in those schools to behave, to respect the king's authority, to follow, again, the law, and to teach them obedience and devotion to the king. So these two are complementary. On one hand, you kind of appease them, you give them what they want to sort of end in the short term, the peasant revolts, but you also invest in indoctrination through mass education in order to prevent in the long term a recurrence of similar episodes of violence. So that's kind of that's how Prussia becomes the first country in the world to adopt a compulsory schooling laws. It was triggered by these peasant revolts and all of the concern that brought up about how to maintain social order in this context of a breakdown in social order and a breakdown in seigneurial authority.
I have two questions now. So one very short is how, I mean, both of them are connected. So the big one, I guess, is about the actual outcomes of these policies, right? How effective they were actually were for maintaining order, right? And then how influential was then the Prussian experience for the adoption of these policies, right? So how much of this, considering that Prussia was the precursor, was about other polities saying, the Prussians were so successful bringing order through education, that's exactly what we want? Or, I mean, was it just the similar internal logics in every place that would drop the process?
Let me address that second question first, about how influential the Prussian experience was. And I'll say it was extremely influential. And the reason for that is that Prussia moved from being a backward country that no one, like a backward economy, to suddenly becoming a superpower that was winning all kinds of wars. And so state makers and rulers around the world wanted to know, what did Prussia do? How did it transition from being this backward economy to being a superpower? What is Prussia doing that we are not doing? And when they looked at Prussia, one of the things that they saw that Prussia was distinct in was that Prussia had a compulsory primary education system that no one else around the world pretty much had something like that. And so we can talk about whether the inference they made that was what enabled Prussia to become a superpower was accurate or not. But the point is that they concluded that having such a state-regulated primary education system was one of the recipes for building a strong state. And so countries around the world, they sent officials, government officials, to Prussia to visit schools, to learn from education policy makers. And we're not just talking about other monarchies in Europe. Latin American countries, Chile, in Argentina, they sent government officials to Prussia to look at the schools there. Horace Mann, who's considered the father of education in the United States, also went to Prussia, came back saying we should emulate the Prussian system in its emphasis to teach people to accept a set of political institutions. And so this was an extremely popular system. It was perceived again to be a recipe for success in building a strong state. Now, what I also talk about in the book and provide much evidence for is that these ideas that circulated from Prussia in and of themselves were not sufficient for people back home to then implement their own education reforms because of what we were talking about before, right? Like they said, okay, Prussia is doing this. It sounds really great, but it's also really costly. We're going to have to construct a lot of schools and hire a lot of teachers. That takes a lot of money. And when there were periods of internal political stability and social domestic peace in countries, they felt like we don't need to do this. Like we already have social order. It was when these episodes of social disorder kicked in that then elites said, okay, it looks like what we're doing is not enough. We need to do something different. And that's when political elites said, okay, let's go ahead with education reform.
Okay. Okay, and like overall, what, because now, I mean, the next question
I'm sorry, no, because
so I want to push in that sense. Yeah, how successful do you think that these policies were on that specific front?
So for me, that's an open question. I don't have an answer in the book that this worked or that this didn't work. What I see are some cases where this seems to have worked and some cases where it seems to have backfired. And what I argue in the book is that whether it worked and whether it backfired in part had to do with how exactly the education system was designed. So how exactly did they construct the curriculum? How exactly were they training teachers? So I'll give you some examples to just provide some more detail here. There are some countries where in order to teach everyone to respect the state and its laws, they went and said, we're going to have a very narrow curriculum, reading, writing, and primarily moral education. And that moral education, some countries said, is going to be focused on, a lot of it will be religious doctrine, because we think, and this is when conservatives were very powerful in these countries, we think that the basis of morality is religious doctrine. And the way to teach kids to behave is by telling them, look, if you misbehave, you go to hell. If you behave well, you go to heaven, right? So some countries take that approach. There are other countries, and Argentina is an example of that, but it's not the only one. France also does this later, toward the end of the 19th century, where the idea that most elites have, these are more liberal, secular elites, their idea is that the basis of morality is the capacity to think abstractly, because moral principles are not unique to a particular religion. Moral principles are universal, and anyone who has the capacity to think abstractly should be able to access those moral principles, that cheating is bad, killing is bad, quarreling is bad, and so on and so forth. And so in countries like Argentina, political elites say, okay, so since we want people to be able to access these moral principles that are abstract and are universal, what we need to ensure is that we're cultivating their capacity to think abstractly. And to do that, we need to teach a lot of math and a lot of science. So they had chemistry, and they had physics, and they had algebra and geometry, etc., etc. Now you can then think of how this can backfire, because you inadvertently give people skills, even though that's not the intent of having these subjects in the curriculum, but you inadvertently are giving them skills that then, in the case of Argentina, enables the formation of a middle class that then forms its own political party to push for overthrowing the existing oligarchic regime and to expand the franchise and so on and so forth, right? And likewise, there's also cases where I think the way of training teachers backfired. So the state usually trained teachers in what were known as normal schools. These were specifically focused on training future teachers, and many of them operated as boarding schools. And the idea behind having them operate as boarding schools was that you were going to get prospective teachers coming from many different parts of the country, and by living all together in one place and being away from their community, they were going to internalize the norms and the values that the state wanted them to adopt. So not necessarily maintain the values that they had learned in their family, in their local community, but become transformed into agents of the state. Now, what happens in a lot of these normal schools is that these become the places where teachers develop a professional consciousness and the first teacher organizations and teacher unions. So the state was hoping that this was going to be a way of in having teachers, future teachers, internalize the state's agenda, when in reality, in some cases, what it does is it creates organizations that then enable teachers to push for autonomy from the state and to contest the state's education policies. So I think this is a fascinating question and a really important one, I think, for intellectual reasons and for policy reasons, to understand the conditions under which these systems accomplished what they were after and the conditions under which they didn't.
Right. The details of institutional design really matters, right?
Yeah.
Let me take us to the present, right? And you use this entire framework to think about education today, right? In a probably a bit more speculative way, but still in very insightful manner as well. What's your take on education today, right? And what are the current tensions that could be shaping the way in which education is being delivered nowadays in the West?
So before I answer your question, can I say something a little bit also about kind of the contemporary problem with the education system that motivated this book? This book, even though it goes back to the foundations of education systems and looks at 200 years of history of education, it began with a concern about the current state of education systems around the world. And what we see is this disconnect between access to schooling and actual learning of skills. And this has been documented by the World Bank, where I worked formerly, and many other organizations, the United Nations as well. But essentially, we've had massive expansion of access to primary education in particular, yet there are many, many kids who have 4 or 5 years of schooling who cannot read a simple sentence. And so this was sort of this puzzle, like, why are governments failing to ensure that kids with 4 or 5 years of education can read a sentence? This was what prompted me to investigate what were the systems created for. And that led me to find, well, they weren't created to promote skills and social mobility and leveling the playing field. Now, when you look at countries today, I think I would split countries into 2 main groups. There's one group of countries where social control continues to be the most important goal of primary education. And this is, there's research on that that's been done also by other people, where they ask education policy makers in developing countries what should be the main goals of education, and consistently the top response is dutiful citizens. So not a skilled workforce or a literate population, but dutiful citizens. So that's like 21st century responses in many developing countries. So again, you have some set of countries where social control continues to be a central goal of primary education. And then there are some countries where I think you have some effort to widen the set of goals, to not just make it about social control, although I don't think there's any country that's willing to give up the social control goal, but where they're saying, okay, but we're also going to try to promote a lot of skills, prepare people for getting good jobs, and so on and so forth. The problem that those countries encounter is that they're trying to accomplish these other goals within the school institutions that they inherited from the past. So the classes are still structured with the teacher standing at the front of the class and everyone sitting in rows and having to raise their hand. And they're not designed to promote critical thinking, to promote debate. Schools continue to have many ridiculous rules that you just have to obey because they are the school's rules. So there are many ways in which the past continues to affect the current operation of schools, hindering schools' ability to advance some of these other more recent goals. I don't know if that helps. And one of the things that I also do in the book, I use data on the prevalence of indoctrination practices in education systems across 160 countries in the world. One of the things that's really interesting is that from 1945 to the present, we don't see a decline in the prevalence of efforts to indoctrinate children. We do see an increase in efforts to promote critical thinking. But when you look at how frequently, I'm talking on average, right? Global average. When you look at the picture of, okay, how much effort is being put into indoctrination and how much effort is being put into critical thinking, efforts in indoctrination still pass like over, they're stronger, more intense than efforts at critical thinking. So I think there's still a ton of room for redesigning, essentially rethinking education systems so that they are actually much more focused on promoting critical thinking. Now we can get to the question of like, well, many governments might think that that's a dangerous agenda to promote critical thinking because they're worried that that's going to lead to more subversive behavior and people will contest the status quo. And that brings us precisely back to the concerns of the 19th century reformers.
It's fascinating, and I really want to thank you for taking the time to have this conversation, because as I just mentioned, it brought all these memories from my childhood, and but also because you really described some of the structural features of our world, right? So you're describing something that we give for granted and just part of the landscape, but it's an essential element of how the world operates and is there for very specific purposes, and it's a constraint for achieving a bunch of objectives that probably we think are irrelevant, and just our implicit familiarity with it does not allow you and does not allow us to change that. So it's fascinating what you did with this book. So I want to thank you again. I want to encourage everyone to take a look at the book. It has many more details than the ones you describe here. So it's very stimulating, intellectually speaking, I would say. So thanks a lot. I hope to see you soon in person.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate the opportunity to share my work with your audience.
Thank you for tuning in today to the Economic and Political History Podcast. Don't forget to stay connected with us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at Javier Mejia C and connect with me on LinkedIn. You can find me as Javier Mejia Cubillos. Until next time, stay engaged. Thank you and take care.